All right, we've built our own event emitter. Now it's time to take a look at the one that you would use in your real-life Node applications. Let's look at the Node event emitter. For starters, as a Node developer, you should be familiar with the Node API documentation, which tells us about all these built-in modules. And so on nodejs.org, under docs, under API docs, I can find events. And this has the documentation for how to use all of its features. But what we'll do is we'll take a quick look at the actual code. Under the lib folder in the actual Node.js source code, there's a JS file called events. And so, if I scroll down, we see that there's a function constructor called event emitter, and that is what is put on module.exports. So notice Node code uses its own module structure when it comes to the JavaScript side of Node. And we'll skip a lot of this because the event emitter for Node has a lot of extra features. And of course it does. We built the simplest possible version, but this is a much better version and the one you should use. But notice we have an emit method, which takes a type, which is really just a property on this hidden events object. If I dig down in here for a while, I can actually see that when I'm emitting events, that is, I'm saying that something happened, if I scroll down a ways, it actually uses .call, which is, if you're not familiar with that, another way to invoke a function. So in other words, it's saying, I have a handler for this event, or maybe multiple handlers. And so if I just have one, I'll call it. Otherwise, it loops across all of them and calls all of those different listeners. See that? So it just used a for loop to loop across the array, and then for every listener in the array, it calls .apply, which is another way of invoking a function. So it's just running functions that are sitting in an array on a property. And if I look for on inside all this code, I'll see that it's actually just shorthand for add listener. So I find my add listener function inside the Node event emitter, and this takes a type and a listener, the listener being a function. In fact, it even double checks that it is. That's why the Node event emitter is better than the one we built. It has a lot more features and is a lot safer to use, but it's still the same basic concept, a type, which is really going to end up being the property name on the object, and then the listener, which will be a function sitting in the array. And so it checks that that object that it has inside it is there. And then it actually has a little bit different logic for the way it adds events in here. If you only have one listener, it doesn't bother making it an array. As soon as you add a second listener, it converts the value to the array, and then after that it just pushes more listeners. But it doesn't really matter how this works internally here because we use it the same way. And it even has some extra code to make sure we don't have any memory leakage and some other things. But it still works the same way. We have on and we have emit and some other methods that you can see if you look in the documentation. But let's go ahead and try using this. I'll just go back to my code that we wrote in the last lecture when we built our own emitter. And because I chose to call my methods emit and on and make them essentially work the same as the Node event emitter, I can just delete my emitter.js file and change my app.js to use Node's event emitter. So instead of a /, I'll get rid of that because it's an internal core JavaScript module, and the name of the JS file was events.js, so I'll just say events. And I can still call this whatever I want. I could call this event emitter or emitter, and it doesn't really matter. And then I'll create a new emitter because this will give me back the constructor, so I can construct new emitters. And actually, that's all I should have to do. The on method took a string and the listener, and the emit method just took the string. And so This should just work. Let's give it a try. Node app.js. There, it worked. I just used the internal node event emitter. Pretty neat, right? Again, a really clean way to structure responding to things that happen in my app. I say manually that they happened, and then all the functions that I've ever set up for when that happens run. Now, you may be thinking, well, what about across modules in different files? Well, you can do that, but you'd have to structure your modules properly, perhaps passing the emitter around or calling the functions and passing it as a parameter if you want to use the same emitter across different modules. But that's actually somewhat unusual. Usually, we're worried about the object that we're currently working with, that it's emitting events and I'm listening for them. And so that's usually happening within a single module, just like we're doing here. But there might be plenty of code in this module that we're listening for that particular event and then running it in different places in the module itself. All right, one other thing. There's one problem with this trick when it comes to the event emitter. It relies on what's called magic strings. Big word alert. A magic string. We mean a string that has some special meaning in our code. You have an if statement that says, if this string equals this, then do this. And that's essentially what our event emitter is, because we give it a string and that determines the property on the object we're looking for. This is bad because it makes it easy for a typo to cause a bug. I type the wrong string and suddenly it doesn't work. And worse, because it's hard for tools like Visual Studio Code or others to help us find that bug, because it's just a string. It's not a variable. So any tool that we might be using can't just tell us, oh, I don't recognize that variable. So relying on strings to be the basis for the logic in your code can be problematic. And a string that is one of those things, something that we are relying on, is called a magic string. So there is a few ways to deal with that. Let's quickly show you one way to deal with strings, in this example, for events. Let's fix the fact that we're relying on this string for our event emitter to function properly. We still will need the string, but let's remove the fact that we're relying on typing it correctly without any kind of help from the debugger or from a tool. Now, you don't have to do this. This is just a pattern, but when you are especially working in larger apps, many developers, it's a really nice pattern. We'll create a new module. Let's call it a config file of some kind. And in my config, I'll just say module.exports will be an object. And then on that will be different configuration values. And let's call this one events. And I'm going to say that each event that I can have in my application will get a property on this object. So we said greet, and I'm going to make it all capitals so that it's really obvious when I'm typing my code that this is an event. See that? So that's it. And I could have many of these. I could maybe have file saved, and it would be the actual string that I would send. And I could have file opened, and this could be whatever string would be there as well. These are the strings passed to the event emitter, but these are the property names. So what I do in this case then is I simply go get my config, and I'll put a // Actually, we'll just keep that a lowercase c because it's just an object. And then I could grab the event's property on it. Or I could just say event, let's call this event config, and just go ahead and grab events, because config itself is an object, and then event is a property on that object. So now I have that, and then everywhere where I had greet, I can use that property name in place of the string, because that's its value. Remember, this is just a string value. So that string is what will be passed here. And also notice that because I'm now using variables and properties, tools like Visual Studio Code are able to help me grab those property names. So this works out a lot better for me because it helps me avoid accidentally mistyping the property. And if I did type it incorrectly, the error I would get would be more helpful, that this property doesn't exist on that object or that it's undefined. So as we can see, it still works the same way, and I'm still just passing strings, but I've gone and centralized the strings themselves and then used those properties everywhere. And that also means I could just change the actual internal name of the event and the string itself if I wanted in one place, and it would change everywhere in my app. But this makes it harder to make a mistake. So that's why it's a nice pattern. All right, so that's it. We've used the Node event emitter. There are many modules in Node, built-in core JavaScript modules, that are built on top of the event emitter. So understanding the event emitter not only lets us use it in our apps, but also understand many other modules where you'll see a .on and a .emit. So how does that happen? Let's take a look.